One of the most interesting aspects of any post-apocalyptic story is the way in which survivors eventually coalesce to form primitive social contracts, or communities, to further their own odds of survival while also aiming to rebuild some form of civilization, in the hopes that one day life will be made worth living again. And when it comes to The Walking Dead, there is no shortage of interesting communities to examine. As such, I've decided to rate each of these communities based on their manpower, resources, safety, and overall ability to survive and maybe even thrive. But there are some communities that I won't be covering in this video, and those specific communities are those of the Civic Republic and the Commonwealth, as those two are literally overpowered and would obviously be at the top of gold tier. I also won't be covering Fear the Walking Dead or any other Walking Dead spin-off, because I sorta need to rewatch all that shit to get a better opinion on their rankings. So if you want me to cover the spin-offs in another video, let me know in the comment section. With that said, let's get this party started by covering
You okay, little man? I'm gonna cut off my feet, huh?
The Vatos gang, based in Atlanta, Georgia, were a large group of survivors who were comprised of gang members, custodians, and nurses, all of which were taking care of the elderly in their little assisted living facility. This ragtag group was led by Guillermo, and they seemingly had a group of roughly 15 to 20 survivors, not including the elderly that they were protecting. This small community had no significant agricultural capabilities, no direct access to fresh water, aside from maybe rain collectors, and they often had to go out scavenging for food, water, weapons, and essential goods. Now on the bright side, they did have plenty of medical supplies, but those supplies were being consumed at an alarming rate by the fossils they were taking care of. Seniors who would eventually die and eventually turn into walkers. So they were basically living in close quarters with a ticking time bomb. A time bomb that could easily be used as leverage against the Vatos as well, considering that none of these old folks could contribute to the group's survival. We also know, from a deleted scene, that these guys got wiped out by some unknown hostile group of survivors. Now, it's my personal headcanon that these decent dudes got smoked by Randall's group, which, by the way, is a group I won't be covering because there isn't enough information on them to properly rank them. That being said, the Vatos didn't have the most secure location. It was decently hidden, but raiders would eventually look for medical supplies in nursing homes, so it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. We also cannot ignore that this facility was in the innermost parts of Atlanta, which isn't exactly safe. Their leader, Guillermo, was also not the most intelligent leader. So as a consequence of all these factors, I have no choice but to place the Vatos in the shit tier.
Welcome to Woodbury.
Before we were introduced to Alexandria, we had the exceptional community of Woodbury, led by Philip Blake, aka the Governor. Woodbury had roughly 70 survivors at the time we as viewers met the community. We also know that they had water, power, food, exceptional shelter, and a strong perimeter wall, manned with security guards and a ruthlessly pragmatic leader who managed to literally build the town from the starting point of a few scared survivors in an apartment building. When we pause and read the notes in Philip's book in the Season 3 episode, Say the Word, we can observe that Woodbury had a budget, sanitation, a literal judiciary, food rationing, and activities, with weekly meetings to establish goals, discuss ideas, and to review the state of the community. Because of the governor's aggressive foreign policy, the town was also well armed, with no real rival communities being present in their region. If not for Philip's sociopathic leadership style, Woodbury could have likely survived indefinitely, being a literal post-apocalyptic superpower in Georgia. The only real weakness Woodbury had, aside from its unstable leader, is that the general population of the town was largely untrained and inexperienced with fighting people and walkers. But with adequate leadership, and with ample time, the town could raise a substantial fighting force. Luckily for them, they did have a handful of excellent warriors and tacticians. The amalgamation of all these facts leads me to place Woodbury at the bottom of gold tier.
We can all live together. There's enough room for all of us.
Of all of the communities in The Walking Dead, none is more iconic than the fucking prison. After winning the war against Woodbury, the prison assimilated many of Woodbury's civilians, and for roughly 7 months, the new community at the prison thrived. They had water due to a nearby creek, and plenty of soil for agriculture and livestock. As a matter of fact, they had more land for farming and water collection than Woodbury. And the prison itself was one excellent shelter with the ability to quarantine entire sections of the building being available to its occupants. The perimeter defense of the prison was, however, lacking, as a decently sized horde could just break through the chain-linked fences. This pretty much required the community to always mop up walkers on site. It should also be mentioned that the chain-linked fence isn't enough to repel most attacks from hostile groups, as driving a car through the fence is sufficient enough to penetrate the prison's outer defenses. That being said, the prison also had excellent leadership, with a council comprised of experienced survivors and with Rick fucking Grimes on the bench, if ever there were to be a need for his excellent wartime leadership. The community also had plenty of fucking guns and even some riot gear. But the prison did have one huge flaw, being that it was the perfect place for an airborne virus to spread. Despite this flaw, the prison only truly failed due to the governor's second attack, which only really worked because of his fucking tank. I don't honestly think any community on this list can realistically prevent a tank from busting through their defenses, so I personally won't hold it against the prison. Be that as it may, the lackluster perimeter defense and the severe weakness to an airborne pathogen in a world of dwindling antibiotics is leading me to place the prison near the top of the silver tier. Not to mention that living in a concrete box isn't exactly great for one's mental health.
Sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive survive. Terminus, sanctuary for all.
Ah, yes, the cannibals of Terminus. You know, they attracted people to an abandoned rail yard, trapped them, and then they would eat them while then taking their supplies. They had little agriculture, and their community wasn't too large in terms of manpower. And their leader Gareth was pretty pragmatic and intelligent, but relying on cannibalism for food is sorta stupid. Eventually, they'd attract the wrong group. Oh wait, that's right. That's precisely what happened to them. They also eventually ate tainted meat, so there's that. The community seemed to be decently defended, and they seemed to have decent shelter, but again, telling people where you are is just not smart for security, especially when your labor pool is equivalent to that of the Vatos. Overall, I'd place Terminus in the middle of bronze tier.
Beth took his place, and I'm losing her, so I need him back.
Ma'am, please, it's
Shepard.
not...
Set up in the upper levels of the Grady Memorial Hospital, the Grady Cops were a super small group of survivors who were delusionally holding on to their law enforcement command structure, all with the hope of civilization eventually returning to save them. That being said, they were pretty safe in their tower, which made for an excellent vantage point for recon. But they had virtually no agriculture, no easy access to water, and their manpower was extremely limited, being even less than the Vatos gang, albeit the cops were decently trained and experienced combatants. They were also led by the hottie that was Dawn, but she was definitely not mentally stable. They also heavily relied on slave labor. Again, they had no farming, no easy access to potable water, and they constantly had to go on risky loot runs in fucking Atlanta. So, long story short, they weren't ever going to last in the long run, and this was 100% confirmed by Greg Nicotero, when he confirmed the community's demise during a question and answer panel. But you know what? At least these cops were safer than the Vatos gang, and at least they had better combatants. They also weren't wasting their resources on people suffering from being stupidly old. As such, I have no choice but to place Dawn and her police brutality gang at the bottom of bronze tier.
Hot diggity dog! This place is magnificent.
Here we are, the walled paradise of Alexandria. A community built during the pre-apocalypse world to be a green, self-sustaining neighborhood. Surrounded by solid metal walls, which are tall as fuck, the community of Alexandria also eventually grew to house roughly 40 survivors. By the end of the series, they had solid agriculture, in fact, the best on this list thus far, along with plenty of livestock, and they also had their own water system and even power. The community is also beautiful, which is definitely nice. Now, generally speaking, the standard of living at Alexandria was excellent, especially later on in the series. Alexandria's leadership was also solid, especially when Rick fucking Grimes was around. They also had a government council along with a rudimentary justice system. And the armed forces of Alexandria were top-notch, consistently outperforming other communities in combat. Speaking of combat, it literally takes a well-armed force to breach the walls of Alexandria. Those walls are probably the best perimeter defense on this list. All things being considered, I'll be placing Alexandria comfortably in the gold tier.
You don't keep people fed, it comes apart. Let's speak the common tongue here. Huh? You don't have shit.
Imagine Alexandria, but smaller, weaker, less secure, and led by a weasel and eventually a revenge-obsessed widow who leaves the town to do some humanitarian work before returning as the same exact character with no character growth, and you've got Hilltop. The walls are great, but they're made of tree trunks and not steel. The manpower is less in quantity and not as well armed as Alexandria. Hilltop does, however, have better farming. Somehow. That said, Hilltop is sort of forgettable, but it still lands a spot at the top of silver, as it has plenty of food, water, security, and decent shelter, with a nice standard of living overall. That is, until it got flattened by the Whisperer's Walker army.
Pissing our pants yet?
The Saviors, to this day, are the single greatest enemy our heroes ever faced. Under the charismatic leadership of the fearlessly intelligent leader Negan Smith, the Saviors operated a feudal empire which enslaved multiple communities. They had literal fucking outposts, and a fucking army that was well equipped and organized. The Saviors were so large that it took a literal coalition of communities to defeat them. And even then, the Allies only won because of Eugene's betrayal of Negan. But despite all of these accomplishments, the Saviors had some critical flaws that would eventually lead to their downfall. The first being that they'd eventually face a rebellion from one of their vassal states, which is precisely what led to their downfall. And the second flaw being that they were too reliant on their subjugated communities for survival. An intelligent, hostile army could defeat the Saviors by merely starving them out, by systematically removing their employed states off the map. They literally needed the Allies to feed them and help them after the Savior War, and eventually the Sanctuary itself had to be abandoned. Had the Saviors changed their behaviors to be more democratic and fair to their vassal states, they could have lasted indefinitely as a democratic free trade empire. But that just wasn't in the cards for them, as their community was literally led by greedy sociopaths. No one really had a good standard of living under their rule either, aside from Negan's inner circle. Be that as it may, the sheer size and scope of their empire forces me to place the Saviors near the top of the gold tier, especially since they had the potential to be something akin to the Commonwealth.
Jesus! It pleases me to see you, old friend. It pleases him indeed, Jerry.
Led by the ever-so-charismatic King Easykill, the Kingdom is easily the best community on this list. They had ample livestock, ample agriculture, access to plenty of water. They also had plenty of manpower to the point of outnumbering Woodbury and Alexandria, and they were the only community who managed to avoid conflict with the Saviors, while also not struggling to meet the demands of those tyrants. The people there were safe and well-fed, even under a 50% tax. Their standard of living was also excellent, and for all intents and purposes, they were a better version of Alexandria, with the Alexandrians only edging them out in terms of combat proficiency and weaponry. And unlike the Saviors, their method of thriving was sustainable. As such, I have to place the Kingdom at the top of the tier list. Truly a gold standard community.
Yours?
We're together.
I lay with him after.
Look, I'm gonna be honest with all y'all. I ain't even spending that much time with the garbage people. Okay, they were weird, had their own language, speaking like Bizarro Superman, and they relied on trade and scavenging. They also had a ton of bodies to work with, but they literally slept in trash piles. And their leader had the shittiest haircut. So with all of that said, I'm gonna have to put them at the top of bronze tier merely for their manpower. They were absolutely weird and absolutely disgusting as a community.
We're breaking all the rules.
Good luck, Tara.
Yeah, we'll work on that, Natanya.
The Oceanside community is basically the Walking Dead's island of Themyscira. Just a bunch of chicks surviving in the wild by a beach. Honestly, they remind me of the show Lost. That said, they've got plenty of guns, plenty of labor, and access to plenty of fishing and water, because they were near a river as well. Oceanside is a wonderful community with two glaring weaknesses: not enough agriculture and no solid perimeter defense. If you can find their community, you can sneak in easily, and you could also attack from the sea. Leadership in the community was also isolationist, which isn't exactly sound in terms of foreign policy. So yeah, I'm gonna place these ladies at the bottom of silver tier.
I'm Alpha. And we only want one thing from you. My daughter.
So I'm gonna get straight to the point with the Whisperers. They had no farming, no shelter. They were glorified nomads living in the very same bushes they shat in. Their main tactic could be countered by a fucking flashbang, and their command structure was nearly decapitated by one dude with swag. I ain't even gonna whisper it. They are bottom of shit tier. Their standard of living was total fucking ass. Anyways, that concludes this gold standard Walking Dead video. If you enjoy this sort of content, please like, share, and fucking subscribe to the channel. Also, remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined, down in the comment section. I'm Captain Gold and hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.